Yes.
The discussions were very much, I think, along the lines of what you've heard the last few minutes, which is that we understood that the failure to provide any financial support to the salaried plan would leave those retirees with reduced benefits. We were not happy about that. We didn't think it was obviously a very good outcome for them. We spent a considerable amount of time thinking about whether there was anything that we could recommend be done for them, and we concluded that it was not commercially reasonable or defensible as a matter of normal bankruptcy procedures.
You said to SIGTARP in my reading of it that GM officials had been too generous in the past, and the auto team had to dial that back a little bit. That was in the SIGTARP report, and that you guys needed to press General Motors to be less generous in relation to the Delphi and the pensions. Now, to what extent did the auto team press that issue, and did that adversely affect even the possibility of the top-offs?
Among the problems at General Motors was that they did not act in a way that one would call commercially reasonable at all times. In fact, they often didn't act in a way that was commercially reasonable, which was a good part of why they were in bankruptcy or insolvent, and Ford, for example, wasn't. So there were any number of places and times when General Motors would recommend or suggest doing something that we did not feel was commercially reasonable, and this was one of them.
Mr. Romero, you mentioned that at times the commercially reasonable standard was used, and then at times it was not used. You mentioned one example. Were there other examples where the auto team did not follow that standard?
So let me be very clear here. I think what our report talks about, and this is what we found, they tried to use the commercially reasonable standard and act as a private investor, but in the end, they were still the government. So there were broader concerns that a private investor would not have. I'll give you a few of them. One, to invest in GM in the first place, when no private investor was investing in GM, according to what GM's CFO told us. That was done out of concern about saving GM because of the impact a GM failure could have on the broader auto industry. A private investor wouldn't necessarily have those same concerns. Two, deciding not to move GM's headquarters out of Detroit for reasons about how it would impact the city of Detroit. Mr. Ratner talks about this in his book. Those are not considerations that a private investor would normally have. Another one was deciding when they made the additional TARP injection as a loan to fund the bankruptcy, rather than take it as debt, which is what it would be, they were worried about too much debt being on GM's books. So they decided to convert that to an equity interest, an ownership interest in the new company. That has lower priority in bankruptcy. So that is not something that had bigger concerns, broader concerns than a private investor. And finally, on what they decided to pay for GM as the purchaser, there was information in the bankruptcy court. GM CEO Henderson talked to us about that Treasury ended up paying more than the enterprise value. I believe this is in Mr. Ratner's book, more than GM's enterprise value. These are all of these decisions are just some examples where the auto team had to consider other things other than just dollars and cents, and not act as just a private investor would. And frankly, they shouldn't have. They're the government, and that's one of the lessons learned out of this.
Well, I guess as my time is winding down, I'm going to argue on behalf of my constituents and these Delphi salaried folks that they should have been included in some of these. If we're not following that standard all the way through, if that's not a hard-line standard, and I understand this is a very, very unique situation, that that should be considered. We have $57 million a year getting pulled out of our local economy because of the pensions, and these Delphi salaried were concentrated in areas like mine, like Mr. Turner's and others, that should have been considered as the whole bankruptcy proceeding was going on, as the headquarters was, which I think is a good move. But there were other moves that could have been made, in my opinion, that could have topped these folks off. And in my estimation, if you're not going to follow that hard line rule when it comes to commercially reasonable, then there's others who lose out because of that. And that's ultimately why we're here. And my time is out, and I just would like to make one final pitch to my colleagues on the other side, that this happens all the time. The distinction here is that the government was involved. But there are bankruptcies every single day in this country, and we need bankruptcy reform because these workers that we're talking about are unique to this particular circumstance, and we're going to advocate as hard as we can for them. But there are thousands and thousands and thousands of other workers across this country who end up on the short end of the stick, who are last in line when it comes to getting made whole, and they get screwed. And in Youngstown, Ohio, and Akron, Ohio, and Cleveland, Ohio, and Pittsburgh, and all through the industrial Midwest, we've seen this for 30 years. And so I hope that we get the enthusiasm from the other side when it comes to bankruptcy reform as well. Mr. Chairman, I'm very thankful for this hearing. Mr. Turner, thank you for your work and cooperation on this as well. And I hope this leads to some situation where these men and women could be made whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I've got about a minute and a half, and my 2 minutes is about 3.5 minutes, I guess, left from this side, which I'll take since I've asked no questions in the second round and yielded my 5. First of all, Ms. Romero, in the '99 spinoff, we keep talking about topping up employees. Was that just salaried employees or non-salaried employees, one or both?
The discussions in 1999 were an agreement to top up the hourly employees, not the salaried employees. The salaried employees weren't represented at that time, and their pension plan was fully funded. Okay. I just wasn't clear as to what took place, which was some years previous. And then, but the final decision, I mean, when you just cut to the chase, there may be problems in bankruptcy, and we may need to do bankruptcy reform. This is not this was not a typical bankruptcy in a civil proceeding, was it? No, and this wasn't even typical for a TARP program. Yeah. This is the only situation in TARP where you have a member of members of Treasury officials being so deeply and significantly involved in the company. Exactly, and again, you said it was ultimately Treasury's decision as the buyer to assume or reject the top-up liability. Treasury, last time I checked, was the United States of America, using public money to, I thought Mr. Ryan said, use the term, I try not to use screwed, but because it gets my wife upset. And, but basically that's what happened. Some people got screwed here in this proceeding. And the unfairness is that those people had also paid their taxes, et cetera, into the Treasury of the United States and should have been treated fairly. Now, probably some of this would never have occurred if everyone would have cooperated. But before I became the chair for 2 years, we couldn't even get the documentation or the cooperation. Mr. Turner turned to me when I became chair. We did the hearing in June, and I demanded the documentation. And you finished your report, and I think you did an admirable job. You're just reporting the facts. And again, this isn't a typical situation. Mr. Ratner had talked about commercially acceptable or reasonable process. And I guess they were trying to cover their bases in all of this. But Mr. Wilson, you testified last summer that unions did not receive special treatment. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
You did. And Ms. Romero, did you say in your report find that unions receive special treatment in the GM bailout and the bankruptcy proceedings?
Well, Treasury gave additional leverage to certain stakeholders,
so
and those were two, the UAW and the bondholders.
But they gave again, something special to the union folks, right?
They established the hierarchy of who would get a deal cut prior to the bankruptcy, and those were the two groups that the auto team picked.
Mr. Wilson, any change in light of their findings?
No, that's just not correct. The UAW and the bondholders had enormous leverage because they were critical components of a potential restructuring transaction. That's why they had leverage, and that's why they were important to the deal. It wasn't because of anything that Treasury did, as I described both in my written and verbal testimony.
And what were the non-union employees, chopped liver?
Unfortunately, anyone who didn't
They were
have a
just
stake,
dumped overboard.
no, that's not. That's not.
But again, the union side, maybe they were entitled to this on the top up, and I have no problem with that. But what I have a problem with is thousands of people left behind, and we're using taxpayer money for the top up. And we also had a testimony today of $1 billion that won't be returned to the Treasury. So I don't view that as fair for all. And Mr. Ryan, Mr. Turner, have to go back and face these people. I faced some of them at the hearing we held in June. Ms. Brooks isn't here. She told me one person that she ran into this week is basically homeless, who was one of these employees that she talked to this past week. And we will leave the record open. Some of the members weren't able to return after the votes, and she's one of them, to cite in the record what this is, how this has affected folks. So again, we're dealing with federal taxpayer funds and how they were distributed, and some people were unfairly treated according to the report. And Treasury did have the discretion to make a different decision. Wouldn't that be correct, Ms. Romero?
Absolutely, it was their decision.
Yes. Okay, let me.
Mr. Chairman, if I could just.
Mr. I'll go turn.
I just want to make,
yes, go right ahead.
Make a point that there were 8 or 9 other union. I just don't want to leave anybody out. So it was the salary, but that list of union members that I gave are also on. We can't forget them as we're advocating for this, that there were other 7, 8, 9 unions that were also included that had been left out. So I just, we talk about the Delphi salary, but it's also these splinter unions as well.
And Mr. Ryan, I think every one of them should have been treated
agreed.
fairly. Again, it's taxpayer money in this. This isn't, I've been involved in business. I've seen bankruptcies, and I've seen how they're settled, and there's a lot of unfairness. There are things that we could do to correct that. This was not a civil or commercial bankruptcy in any sense of the normal way these things are conducted. Again,
that's why I'm sitting here with you, Mr.
That's
Chairman.
my beef. And if there were some way in a bipartisan manner to make people whole, I mean, TARP is still not done. I don't know if legislatively that can be done or however, but I think it's a great injustice to thousands of people. And our job is to, again, try to be fair to those folks. I'd be glad to work with you and others of both sides of the aisle to see what we could do with that.
Well, Mr. Turner and I have been working on this for a long time, and we welcome that opportunity as well as the HCTC extension for the next year, because a lot of these folks are having huge health care costs as well. So I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman, and let's make something happen.
Okay. Any additional questions?
No, just thank you.
Mr. Turner, additional question?
Great, thank you. I have 3, and I do want to acknowledge Mr. Ryan's dedication and just hard work on this. This has been really a team ball project here and a bipartisan project. Rob Andrews is being another, of course, on the other side of the aisle, and certainly in the Senate there are a couple others. And on follow-up to my congratulations to Mr. Ryan, thanks to Mr. Ryan, I unfortunately had to step out, and while I was gone, Mr. Ryan asked a question to Mr. Ratner, and so I'm going to paraphrase, not having been in the room, your answer, and I'm going to ask you to say it again and elaborate on it so that I can understand it. He was discussing with you the termination of the salaried pension plan, and you indicated that you had considerable discussion on the termination of the salaried plan. Is that a correct accusation of what occurred when I was not in the room?
I'm not sure what discussion, I'm not sure with whom you are thinking we had discussions.
Perhaps you could tell, well, first off, did you have any discussions with respect to the termination of the salaried pension plan?
Yes,
And those discussions occurred prior to its termination?
correct.
Who did you have those discussions with?
I had one or more discussions with Fritz Henderson, who was then the CEO of General Motors, and we had a number of discussions among the auto team members.
So you spoke to Mr. Feldman?
I believe so.
Yeah. So when I asked Mr. Feldman whether or not he'd had any discussions and he didn't recall it, you do recall having had a conversation with Mr. Feldman with respect to terminating the salary pension plan?
I
With
thought
Mr.
your
Wilson?
question, Mr. Feldman, was in the context of the PBGC.
Have you had any, did you recall having discussions with the PBGC with respect to termination of the plan?
I don't recall.
Would you say that, I mean, would you deny that you did?
I said I didn't recall.
So you don't recall whether or not you did also, or didn't, right? I
That's
mean, you
correct.
could have.
I could have, but I don't recall.
Well, luckily, with the subpoenas that have been issued, we're going to get even more of the information because Mr. Feldman had no recollection of his discussion with respect to termination of the pension plans until I handed him his own email. And Mr. Ratner, I look forward to addressing that issue with you again with perhaps your own emails. Mr. Wilson, one of the issues in the GAO report is this concept of the conflicts of interests, the multiple roles of Treasury is, I think, the heading in the report. And we talk about Treasury having a, the treasurer on the board of PBGC. We have Treasury as TARP, purchaser of GM. We have Auto Task Force, Treasury. We have many of those. You've left the Auto Task Force. You've left any role at Treasury. But it's my understanding you were subsequently appointed to the PBGC Advisory Committee, is that correct?
I was recommended by Senator Mitch McConnell's staff to the White House that ultimately decided to appoint me as a representative of the people at large.
So was that a yes? I didn't understand it.
Yes.
Okay. Are you still on the PBGC Advisory Committee?
Yes.
Okay. Ms. Romero, thank you for the clarity of your answers among what at times becomes a heated and a obtuse, I don't know, where the answers here are not always the clearest. On your report on page 29, you state that the audit, in the audit, you state that after the decision was made to not make the salary retirees whole, Dr. Summers prepared a briefing memo for President Obama in August of 2009. Can you tell us who Dr. Summers is?
Larry Summers was the, one of the heads with Secretary Geithner of the Auto Task Force.
I know it's in the report. I just wanted, for the clarity of the record, for it to be stated. Was this memo provided to you or your staff?
We were provided access, but we were not given the memo.
So you've seen the memo?
No, I've not seen the memo.
Someone on your team did see the memo?
Someone on I should say this, someone on my team saw a draft of an email that contained the memo.
Do you know what was in the memo?
Yes.
Could you tell us, please?
Sure. A Delphi salaried retiree had written a letter to the President to describe his personal situation. The President had asked his advisors for information about the situation. The memo discussed how this person would receive less benefits on their pension, how there it describes the 1999 agreement, the spinoff of Delphi. It describes how discussions between the UAW and GM in 1999. It then discusses how, as part of GM's bankruptcy, the top-up for the UAW retirees would be given, but not for the salaried employees. It discusses that the salaried retirees did not have leverage because they did not have current workers at GM, and it also discussed how the salaried plan was fully funded by GM in 1999.
Do you know who briefed the President from that meeting, memo?
The memo came from Mr. Summers. I don't know if there was any verbal briefing to the President.
And no action to reverse the decision came from the President of the White House that you're aware of after the memo informing the President that the salary retirees lacked the leverage of UAW.
That's correct. We did not see any change or any action taken after the memo to the President.
Mr. Romero, I'm going to read something from your written statement that I'd like you to elaborate on, because I think it really goes to the issue of the power and authority that Treasury exerted here. You say, an auto team official told Sig Tarp that the auto team's approach with GM was to push them and to question them. And another one said, we pushed GM toward making the changes necessary to becoming a viable company. And when asked, how is it that this was done, at the bottom of the paragraph on page 12, which is the third paragraph down, the auto team official said, well, they could, but then they couldn't exist. I mean, as I said, as the lender, we had a fair amount of leverage. Now, that's a constant theme throughout your report. Could you elaborate on that just a moment? Because that's, I mean, that's fairly but for. GM goes away if they don't do what Treasury says.
Well, I think this goes to the bigger issue, and I think the best way to discuss this is to tell you what the auto team told us and tell you what GM told us. So Mr. Bloom told us from the auto team that Treasury did not want to start running the company, but when dealing with taxpayer resources, we, the government, were ultimately holding the purse strings, and we reserved the right to tell GM we would not back them. So when we asked Mr. Bloom how the auto team conveyed its preferences or nudged GM to see things the way the auto team did, given that ultimately GM could do its own thing, that's when he said, well, they could, but then they couldn't exist. I mean, as I said, as the lender, we had a fair amount of leverage. GM officials told us, there's just a couple statements. One, ultimately, it was that GM is not in control and GM is totally dependent. The auto team replacing the CEO was an early indicator that Treasury, as the main investor, would have significant influence over GM's decisions and operations. GM officials told us the auto team was pushing GM to be tougher and take more significant actions other than what we would have done on our own volition, that GM put forward recommendations, but ultimately the purchaser made decisions, which was Treasury. So there were a lot of situations that we found where the auto team can take the position that they did not intend to have significant influence on GM's decisions and operations, but we have GM officials telling us that they felt that they were not in control and that the auto team did have significant influence on GM's decisions and operations. So the auto team may not have intended to have significant influence, and they may not believe that they had it, but they did. And if I could just take 2 seconds, I want to read one part in Mr. Ratner's book, which is very much on point. This is quoting from Mr. Ratner's book. Larry, meaning Mr. Summers, Larry had pushed us from the start to play down Team Auto's role and keep the emphasis on GM and Chrysler managing their own affairs. That ended up being partly true of GM in the sense that Harry, meaning Mr. Wilson, and his team tried to set parameters and assumptions for its executives in the hope that they then could produce the specifics of a restructuring plan. And he goes on to say, in reality, the talent and determination of Harry, and then he names David and Sadiq, who were on the auto team, were what really drove the process. As we drafted press statements and fact sheets, I would constantly force myself to write that GM had done such and such. Just once I would have liked to write we instead. And that's what Mr. Ratner wrote. That's consistent with what we found, that the public statements Treasury made downplayed their influence, downplayed their role.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Conley, I yield you 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to come back to that in a minute, but Mr. Wilson, you objected that Ms. Romero was inaccurate when she said Treasury gave leverage to the union and bondholders. You weren't really allowed to explain your objection. Please do so now.
Sure. There was no doubt that UAW and the bondholders had a lot of leverage, but it was not in any part as a result of Treasury actions or anyone else's actions. They had a lot of leverage because they were critical actors in a restructuring. You need the UAW to manufacture cars, and therefore they were critical for that, and they would always be critical. And the bondholders were critical because they were a large stakeholder. Even though they had no ongoing involvement, they were critical because they could object and hold up the proceedings and cost the taxpayers lots of billions of dollars in a prolonged bankruptcy that would also imperil the potential viability of General Motors.
So, good point you're making here, that the leverage they had was self-created by virtue of their power over many years. It wasn't something conferred upon them by Larry Summers or Mr. Ratner.
That's correct.
Mr. Miller, Mr. Ratner, Mr. Wilson, Mr. Feldman, any and all of you, but here's GM facing bankruptcy. Why would they choose to honor these union contracts? Could there be a good business reason to do that, or is it just because somebody somewhere said, take care of the unions? Is it at all conceivable there could be a business reason if you want to save the industry and save GM through the bankruptcy process and have them come out whole, that you might want to honor that contract?
The issue is that without honoring the contracts, there wouldn't be any workforce. And the last time that GM, I forget the year, allowed a strike to go on, it was exceedingly expensive and almost destroyed the company. To operate and become feasible, you must have the workers who produce the product. And that was a prevailing theme, even though the negotiations were very difficult with the union in trying to get concessions. But it's a long history going back to Walter Reuther of a lot of adversity. But without a labor force, there is no feasibility. And as far as the GM management was concerned, if the United States of America wanted to pay everybody and GM not file a bankruptcy petition, that would have been perfectly fine. But from my observation, what the auto team was concerned about is how do you protect taxpayer money? If you're just going to open up the door and everybody's going to be paid, well, then you don't need the bankruptcy. But the bankruptcy is a zero-sum game. There's only so much value, and the fight is who's going to share in that value. And there are priorities that are commanded by the bankruptcy code, and there are business reasons why, unfortunately, from my perspective, unions have a lot of leverage. And the question is, how much money are you going to put in? From my perspective, again, the United States and Canada operated as if they were secured lenders. They were trying to protect their investment. And after all, you're talking about a company which, as people have described here, prior to bankruptcy, was too lax. They took on too much credit. They gave out too much money. Well, what this task force was trying to do is to make sure that GM stayed within the line of what would be feasible to get to a viable company.
And in retrospect, and again, I invite others, would it be fair to say, looking back, that actually that kind of worked out?
Yes.
That it was a wise business decision not to vitiate the contract or ignore it?
From my perspective, yes.
Mr. Ratner, Ms. Romero quoted from your book a conversation you had with Larry Summers. Would you comment on her comment?
Yeah, Ms. Romero, I don't think fully understands the difference between being involved in day-to-day operations and being involved in a restructuring. And she sort of tossed those back and forth without making the right distinction. We had no involvement in the day-to-day running of General Motors. We did not decide what kind of cars they were going to make. We did not decide which plants were going to function. We did not decide how much they were going to discount their new model. We didn't pick new models. We didn't pick executives. We didn't do any of the things that one would associate with the, quote, day-to-day running of the company. The section she read from my book pertains entirely to the efforts that we made to affect the restructuring of General Motors, in which we were heavily involved. We were investing ultimately a total of $50 billion, I think $12 billion of it under the Bush administration, into the company, and we had a responsibility to the taxpayer to be sure that money was invested wisely. And if we had not been involved in those restructuring plans, if we had not pushed back on General Motors, if we had not insisted on a viable restructuring plan, then I would be relatively confident in saying we would be sitting here in front of you having a different discussion, which is, why were you not watching over the taxpayer money? Why were you not involved in this restructuring? Why did you not insist that it was being done on commercially reasonable terms?
Ms. Romero, you've heard Mr. Ratner's explanation, and from his point of view, you perhaps misread what the nature of that conversation was, namely it was focused on restructuring, not on day-to-day management and operational decisions.
So earlier, when I talked about the actions of what Treasury's influence was, what I did was I read quotes from Mr. Bloom, who is not here, on the auto team, and I also read quotes from GM officials. And I think this is what's important. And this is what I was saying earlier. It may be that the auto team went into their job not intending to get so involved or have such significant influence on the decisions and operations of the company. And it may be that as they sit there today and look back at what they did, that they don't think they had that influence. But ultimately, the only one who can say whether they felt that influence was the company itself. And what the company officials told us in interview after interview after interview after interview was that they were not in control, that the leverage was held by Treasury. And when they talk about we weren't involved in the selection of executives, one of the first things they did was Mr. Ratner went to GM and asked the CEO to resign and then put in his own replacement, his own pick of the CEO. And that CEO told us that the GM's board was very upset by that and said that the auto team had usurped their authority. And he said to us that was an early indicator that Treasury, as the investor, would have a significant influence on our decisions and operations. Those are his words. So when Mr. Ratner talks about our interpretation is wrong, we aren't interpreting. We are laying out for the public all of the things that the auto team told us and all of the teams that GM officials told us.
Ms. Romero, let me just posit a little devil's advocate.
Sure.
The U.S. taxpayer is pumping tens of billions of dollars to save this company and try to make sure we don't lose all those jobs and the whole industrial core of our economy. And it's not entirely unexpected that the existing GM management team watching this thinks, what a pain in the butt. Who needs their interference? I'll take your money and keep your opinion to yourself. Thank you very much, because we really have done nothing wrong. We actually know what we're doing, and you people don't. And they're going to resent any intrusion, any second guessing, any kind of new leadership change. That's kind of human nature. And as a taxpayer and as somebody who oversees taxpayer investments, I'm not entirely unsympathetic to Mr. Ratner and his team trying to protect my interests. Now, maybe from someone's point of view, it went too far. But the fact that you're relying on GM interviews, well, I'm not entirely surprised, having mucked it up to a fairly well and forced the taxpayer to bail them or let them go under, that they resent are exercising some oversight responsibilities. I mean, couldn't that be the case, Mr. Romero?
Oh, I think it absolutely could be the case, but I do want to point out it's not just we're relying on interviews of GM. We interviewed 84 people. We're also relying on the interviews of the auto team officials who sat here today, and another auto team official, Mr. Bloom, who did not, and the statements that they said. But I think you raise a really good point, Ranking Member Conley, which is maybe that's in the taxpayer's best interest, and we're okay with that. Our point is just be transparent. Just say it and let the American people judge, like yourselves and all of us who funded the bailout, do we agree or disagree? But the point is, don't hide behind roles or don't try to downplay your involvement. Just tell the truth. Because you know what? The American people are pretty smart. We know there was a crisis. We know something had to be done with GM, and we understand that their role was monumental and that they had to do something to restructure GM. If you just be transparent and tell the truth, then the American people will decide. And that's what we've done. What we did in our report, if you'll see, there's not a lot of judgments in our report on this. What there is we just told it like a story, a chronological story, put the facts out there so that the American people and all of you can decide whether you agree or disagree.
Thank you. This is a fascinating story. I know we'll return to it, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for allowing me to.
Chairman, if I could have
extra
one
No,
moment.
you have 30 seconds.
Okay, great. Well, Mr. Connolly, I would just,
No, you went over your 30 seconds. I'm going to give him
As-
the
as
30
usual-
seconds, and then we'll be exactly even. So reset the clock. Give Mr. Turner 30 seconds. He's determined to get
I'm
the
going to be
last
the
word.
Federal Express delivery man here on the 30 seconds of peaking. Can I start while you're setting it? What I was going to say, Mr. Connolly, Ms. Romero, once again, has been incredibly articulate about what her position is and what she's done. And you are absolutely right, and you're both right, that she does not conflict with your conclusions or opinions. What she conflicts with is the public statements that have been made and the statements by Treasury, and that's the part that is disturbing, I think, to all taxpayers, is that there's one story being told and there's one that's being reality. And it's not as if they relied on interviews. They had papers and emails. Mr. Ratner, I want to give you one opportunity, because we all know that your statement about picking executives is not accurate. Do you want to amend that, because you're under oath? I mean, and we know when people are speaking, sometimes they get a little carried away. If you'd like to recharacterize that, I think everybody here would be very pleased.
I was referring to picking executives below the CEO level. We did, obviously, it's public record, we did obviously make a decision that there needed to be a new CEO. It was in the context of a commercially reasonable investment decision.
Great, because I just didn't want you to be subject to perjury for saying something that wasn't accurate or truthful. Thank you.
Okay, I think we've even missed, well, unless anyone wants to go another round. Okay. Well, I think everyone's had ample opportunity. I know we could go on. And there are additional questions. There are questions for members that are not here that will be submitted. And with concurrence of the minority, we're going to leave the record open for a period of 2 weeks. And I will advise the witnesses, too, that they may submit questions to you to respond, which will be part of the record, made part of the record. So we have completed this hearing. I thank the witnesses for their participation. I thank the members for their involvement. I think it is an important issue. I'm sorry that it was not resolved before Mr. Connolly and I took over the subcommittee, but again, we now have the report of the Special Inspector General. We have additional information. If we need additional hearings to resolve pending issues, we'll conduct that. But I promised a field hearing, which we conducted, and a Washington hearing as we completed and got the SIGTARP report. So I thank all of you for your participation. There being no further business before the Government Operations Subcommittee, this hearing is adjourned.